Hello, I'm Tim Smith with the Adams County Historical Society, and welcome to a beautiful Monday afternoon for another episode of Monuments Monday. And on this episode, it's sort of part two of Stephen's 5th Maine Battery. And if you thought last week's episode had a really interesting story, wait till you hear this, because the story associated with this monument and one of the people involved in this part of the battlefield, I think, is even more dramatic. But the 5th Maine Battery put up a monument on Stevens Knoll to their second and third day position. And here along this Park Avenue, they put a monument to represent their position on July 1st. As we mentioned earlier, the 5th Maine Battery are part of the 1st Corps Artillery Brigade, commanded by Charles Wainwright. And this battery arrived with the rest of the brigade on the afternoon of July 1st, 1863. Initially, they were placed south of the Seminary building. And then, just before the Southern Army attacked on the afternoon of July 1st, they were moved to a position here between the Charles Croft House and the Chambersburg Turnpike along this ridge here in front of us. Now, although this area that we're standing in is private property, and I should mention that the campus of the Lutheran Theological Seminary is probably the scene of the heaviest fighting of the Battle of Gettysburg that remained in private hands. So there was some heavy fighting along this ridge. But even though this seminary campus is sort of private, this road was put in by the Gettysburg National Military Park Commission in the 1890s. And we'll show you a photograph of this monument with its two cannons associated with it from 1898. This is a William Tipton image, and at that time you can see behind me is the barn associated with the James Henry Thompson house. And you might look down the street here and see James Henry Thompson's house. And he, if you remember, is the son of the widow Thompson who lived in that house better known as Lee's headquarters. Also in this historic photograph, you might see to the left of the barn the Alexander Riggs house that stood up there. The present building we're looking at, that for many years was part of the seminary campus, called North Hall, this was built in the 1920s. And although I know there's a ghost book that says that this is the barn rebuilt into a house, and you know it has this ghost story attached to it, that barn was torn down. It was on a totally different footprint and does not represent the site of that house very well. So I want to tell you a little bit about the 5th Maine Battery in the fighting on July 1st, and then we have this just incredible story associated with this. The part of the battle that we're talking about that the 5th Maine Battery was involved in was on the afternoon of the first day in the attack of the Southern infantry along this final defensive position of the Northern Army. A lot of this land here was recently protected by American Battlefield Trust. And we'll show a map here of the Union line of battle, or we'll provide a link to an article about this part of the fight on their website. And one thing that's kind of interesting is that from a position just south of the Lutheran Seminary to a position just north of the Chambersburg Turnpike, there were 22 Union artillery pieces. There were 4 guns of under the command of a guy named George Breck from the New York Light Artillery. There were 3 guns of James Cooper's Pennsylvania Artillery. There were the 6 guns of Stevens. There were 2 other guns from the New York Battery under a guy named Wilbur, and there were 6 guns of James Stewart's Battery B 4th U.S. Artillery north of the Chambersburg Pike. So 22 different artillery pieces along this line. And when the Southern Army attacked, these cannons just ripped into the Southern assault. But before the cannons could fire, they had to wait for the Union infantry to fall back into this position. Now, according to the dedication speech that was given at this site by the 5th Maine Artillery, the whole line of battle from right to left was then one continuous blaze of fire. The space between the 2 ridges was completely filled with a thin line of the blue smoke of infantry, making it difficult to distinguish friend from foe, while the artillery from the higher position belched forth a tremendous fire of shot and shell, throwing their deadly missiles in rapid succession into the ranks of the enemy advancing on our direct front. Our infantry, by the overwhelming numbers of the enemy, 5 to 1, I don't know about that, were forced back upon a line with the artillery, some of them crouching under the very muzzles of the guns of the 5th Battery to avoid its fire. When our front was clear and within canister range, using double charges, the guns of the 5th Battery were turned to the right on the columns of the enemy. And when their first line was within 100 yards of the Seminary, it was brought to a halt by Stewart's, Stevens, Reynolds, and Cooper's batteries. Stevens expending about 57 rounds of canister. Can you imagine? And that, is like 9 or so rounds of canister for each of the 6 Napoleons here. And, and it wasn't that long of a space of time that they fired this canister in. It must have been just devastating. There's a really dramatic account of this given by a member of the 2nd Wisconsin, and that unit would have fallen back into either Stevens' battery or part of Cooper's battery when they were firing. According to Robert Beecham, almost at the same time, as if every lanyard was pulled by the same hand, this line of artillery opened fire, and Seminary Ridge blazed with a solid sheet of flames. And the missiles of death that swept its western slopes no human beings could endure. After a few minutes of the belching of artillery, the blinding of smoke shut out the sun and obstructed our view. We of the infantry fell into line between the artillery sections and assisted with our musketry, keeping up the fire until our pieces grew hot in our hands and the darkness as of night had settled upon us. Not a Confederate reached our line. After we had ceased firing and the smoke of battle had lifted, we looked again, but the charging Confederates were not there. Only the dead and dying remained on the bloody slopes of Seminary Ridge. It was the brigade of Alfred Scales, North Carolinians, that bore the brunt of the fire of Stevens' 5th Maine Battery. And according to Thomas Latimer of Company F, 34th North Carolina, the regiment was exposed to a deadly enfilading fire from artillery on the left and infantry in front from behind breastworks. Because of this thunderous fire, for the first time in its history, the brigade was repulsed. Of course, 2 days later, the same brigade would be involved in Pickett's charge, and for the second time in its history, it would be repulsed. Now, things went very well for the 5th Maine Battery at this location, and they halted Scales' advance. But other events were occurring nearby that would cause the retreat of the 1st Army Corps. Perrins, South Carolinians, were breaking through the Union line at the Seminary, and Oak Ridge was collapsing, and north of the town, the 11th Corps was in retreat through the town, and the 5th Maine Battery would be forced to vacate this position and head back into the town of Gettysburg itself. Now, one of the members of the 5th Maine Battery was Charles Oliver Hunt, and he was a lieutenant in charge of one of the sections. And just before the 5th Maine Battery retreated, he was riding across the rear of the guns, and a bullet hit him in the right hip. It hit his revolver and holster and actually broke off a piece of the ramrod and drove it into his hip. And after he was wounded, actually he got on his horse after he was wounded, and he rode over to Captain Stevens and informed him that he was going to have to ride into town for medical attention. And he announced to Captain Stevens that he was going to visit his sister, which is kind of odd. The first time I read about this story, I just thought, what an incredible coincidence. So Charles Hunt is born in Gorham, Maine in 1839. He had graduated from Bowdoin College in 1861. And upon graduation, he visited his sister. His sister, Mary Hunt, had married a man, a banker from Philadelphia named T. Duncan Carson, and I believe 1856. And Carson had accepted a job as the cashier of the Bank of Gettysburg in 1857. And in 1861, upon Charles Hunt's graduation, he decided to spend some time with his sister, and so he moved to Gettysburg. And he lived here from September of 1861 till December of 1861, when he returned home and became a member of the 5th Maine Battery. So here, on the first day of the fighting, as luck would have it, he's wounded right here behind us on this ridge, and rides into town to see his sister. And we're fortunate that Charles Hunt has a memoir at Bowdoin College, and recently a descendant of the Hunt family came to the Adams County Historical Society, and we gave us a copy of his manuscript with a story in it. But he knew where his sister lived because he had lived in Gettysburg for a while. He went to the bank, he knocked on the door, and can you imagine surprise of his sister when there he was on her doorstep, wounded. We have a few other references to this story. One of them being Mary Horner, who lived on Chambersburg Street. And after the war, she was interviewed, and she said during the first day of the battle, she had gone to the Duncan house, and she was in the house when this occurred. She says, word was sent to the citizens to go to their cellars, as the enemy were driving our men, and the fighting would probably be house to house in our streets. Mrs. C, Mrs. Carson, proposed that we should go to the vault of the bank, which we did. 19 women and children, 2 dogs, and a cat. Apparently, there wasn't room enough in the bank vault for the men. They stayed out in the house and put the women and the children in the bank vault. While in close quarters, a message came that Lieutenant Hunt of the 5th Maine Battery was at the door wounded. He was the brother of Mrs. C, who ordered him to be taken to the cellar. And there, lying on a piano box, Dr. H extracted the bullet from his leg and cared for his wound. And Dr. H is Mary Horner's husband, Dr. Charles Horner, and he performed this operation in the vault of, or I should say in the cellar of the house. Now, T. Duncan Carson rented a house from the Bank of Gettysburg, and we'll show it here in a photograph. We know where that house was in town on York Street, and of course the bank building in the Carson residence, neither building stands today, but it's part of the Gettysburg Hotel ballroom, and they've actually put the door of the original vault on the wall in the annex of the hotel, and we'll show that. And it's just a fascinating story, and we have an account by Charles O. Hunt. He actually wrote a letter to his mother on July 4th, 1863. And part of that letter: "Dear Mother, here I am lying on my back in Mary's back parlor, making myself as comfortable as possible. I suppose before this reaches you, you will have heard that I was one of the victims of the great fight of Gettysburg. But I hope you have heard no exaggerated account. My wound is very slight, and I shall be about in 2 weeks at most. I cannot tell you much about the fight, for I was hit on the first day. During the fight, whenever there was any cannonading, they all went into the bank vault. When I first got there, there were 19 in there and 2 dogs. He doesn't mention the cat. Everybody was dreadfully frightened." I mean, can you imagine the coincidence of a man from Maine fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg and then ending up being cared for in his sister's house? It's just one of the more interesting side stories of Gettysburg. I should mention that Charles O. Hunt went on to become the historian of the 5th Maine Battery Association, and he was one of the committee members who picked out the 5th Maine monument on Stevens Knoll, and actually picked out the spot, and undoubtedly was present here during the dedication ceremony of the monuments. Please like and subscribe to our channel.